The photograph you're looking at right now captured the most dangerous decision Frank Sinatra ever made. Look closely, Cal-Neva Lodge, a resort rising above the frozen waters of Lake Tahoe. Frank is leaning across a table, finger jabbing the air, face twisted with rage. The man sitting across from him, Sam Giancana, America's most powerful mob boss, head of the Chicago outfit, a man who could order a murder with a snap of his fingers. What you're seeing in this photograph is the moment Frank chose his pride over his safety, over his career, over his life, over everything he'd built. In the 6 months following this confrontation, Frank would lose all his casino licenses. Political connections he'd maintained for decades would evaporate overnight. The FBI would open files that would follow him until the end of his life. But in this frozen moment, this single second, none of that has happened yet. Frank doesn't know he's destroying himself. He only knows one thing: he's done taking orders. This is the story of how the world's most powerful entertainer went to war with the Mafia, and why both sides lost everything. But here's the real question: when Frank was this powerful, why did saying no to the mob destroy him? The answer lies in a deal you were never told about. To understand this photograph, you first need to understand the arrangement. Frank Sinatra didn't just know the mob, he owed them. Late 1940s. Frank's career was dead. The teenage girls who once screamed for him had moved on to other crooners. Columbia Records didn't renew his contract. Paramount cut his film roles. His voice was failing from throat hemorrhages caused by overwork and stress. Broke, washed up, forgotten at 35. Frank Sinatra was playing small clubs for $500 a night when he could get booked. His wife Ava Gardner was the biggest star, and their marriage was falling apart. He was drinking heavily, taking pills to sleep. This wasn't a career slump, this was oblivion, and the mob brought him back. But how? Do the names Lucky Luciano, Willie Moretti, Frank Costello mean anything to you? These were the heads of America's most powerful crime families, men who controlled unions, owned politicians, and ran businesses from nightclubs to construction companies, and they all loved Frank. In the 1940s, when Frank was singing in some New Jersey nightclubs, he got close to mob bosses, not because he sought them out initially, but because in those days, if you wanted to work in nightclubs, you worked with the mob. They owned the venues, they controlled the entertainment unions. Frank didn't just work for them, he befriended them. He entertained them at private parties, invited them to his family gatherings, sang at their weddings, became their symbol of class and sophistication. And you know what the mob does in return for loyalty? They own you. Willie Moretti was Frank's local protector in Hoboken. He was the kind of guy who could call club owners and say, "You're gonna put this kid on stage, or you'll have problems." And those problems usually involved broken windows, labor strikes, or worse. In 1947, when Frank needed help getting his Hollywood career back on track, Willie introduced him to Lucky Luciano. Luciano was hiding in Havana after being deported from the United States, but he still controlled all the East Coast operations from his exile. Frank met with Luciano in Havana. This meeting was later photographed, and those photos would haunt Frank for decades. Critics claimed Frank was carrying $2 million in cash to Luciano. Frank denied it, but the relationship was real. Just months after this meeting, Frank landed the role of Maggio in From Here to Eternity, a role that everyone in Hollywood said he was wrong for, a role that revived his entire career. That role won him an Oscar and made him bankable again. Coincidence? Harry Cohn, the head of Columbia Pictures, operated under union and mob control. When they said take Frank, Harry took Frank. Some say Cohn received a visit that convinced him. Others say it was just business. That horsehead scene in The Godfather, rumor has it, it's based on this very story about Frank Sinatra. But the truth is far more complex than a movie scene. The mob didn't just turn Frank into an actor, they turned him into an empire. Think about Las Vegas. In the 1950s, Vegas was a casino town just starting to grow in the middle of the desert. And who was financing most of those casinos? The mob. They were building monuments to American excess with money from illegal operations across the country. They gave Frank a stake in the Sands Hotel, made him a partner in Cal-Neva Lodge, ensured he made hundreds of thousands of dollars with every performance. Frank's Vegas shows became legendary, not just because of his talent, but because the mob made sure every high roller, every celebrity, every politician knew that Sinatra at the Sands was the place to be. But there was a price. Frank was the mob's showcase. He made them look legitimate. When Sinatra performed at your casino, you weren't a gangster. You were a respectable businessman hosting America's greatest entertainer. You could sit in the front row, be photographed with Frank, and suddenly you had class by association. Sam Giancana was the pinnacle of this relationship. Giancana became the leader of the Chicago outfit in 1957 after the previous boss was murdered. Ruthless, connected, untouchable. He was linked to over 300 murders, but was never convicted of a single one. He had judges in his pocket, cops on his payroll, politicians who owed him favors, and he considered Frank his personal asset. When Giancana wanted to reach someone powerful, Frank made the introduction. When Giancana wanted to meet a woman, Frank arranged it. When Giancana wanted to appear sophisticated instead of scary, Frank provided the cover. In fact, Giancana met one of his most famous girlfriends, Phyllis McGuire of the singing McGuire sisters, through Frank's connections. But the biggest favor came in 1960. When John F. Kennedy ran for president, Sam Giancana saw an opportunity. If JFK won, he thought the Justice Department would back off organized crime, the heat would be off, the investigations would slow down, and Frank was the perfect middleman for this deal. The 1960 presidential election was one of the closest races in modern American history, and Frank Sinatra was John F. Kennedy's secret weapon. But why was Frank so important? First, Frank was friends with JFK's father, Joe Kennedy. Joe knew Frank from the old Hollywood days and understood his influence. Joe himself had made his fortune during Prohibition, some say with mob connections, so he understood how power really worked in America. Second, Frank was the leader of the Rat Pack. Dean Martin, Sammy Davis Jr., Peter Lawford, Joey Bishop. This group wasn't just an entertainment collective, it was a cultural force. They defined what it meant to be cool in America. When they performed, presidents attended. When they endorsed someone, it mattered. And Peter Lawford was JFK's brother-in-law, married to Kennedy's sister Patricia. Frank became the unofficial Hollywood coordinator for Kennedy's campaign. He gathered celebrities, raised money, rewrote the song High Hopes as Kennedy's campaign anthem. He organized fundraisers that brought in millions of dollars. But his real work was behind the scenes. Frank was the bridge between Sam Giancana and JFK's campaign managers. Let me explain how this worked. The West Virginia primary was absolutely critical. JFK needed to win there to prove that a Catholic could win in a Protestant state, but the state was heavily Protestant, heavily anti-Catholic in some areas. Polls showed Kennedy losing badly. Sam Giancana called union leaders, the ones who controlled the miners' unions, the Teamsters, the laborers. "You're going to support Kennedy," he said. And they did. Union halls suddenly had Kennedy posters. Union bosses told their members how to vote. At the same time, Giancana's men distributed money throughout West Virginia. They bought votes. Some estimates say up to $4 per vote in certain counties. They threatened opponents. Polling places that favored the other candidate had problems on election day. JFK won West Virginia by a shocking margin and gained the momentum he needed. But Illinois was even more critical. Without Illinois, JFK couldn't win the presidency, and Chicago controlled Illinois, and Chicago was Sam Giancana's playground. Giancana later bragged that he delivered Illinois for Kennedy. He controlled enough precincts, enough poll workers, enough ballot boxes to swing the state. On election night, as votes were counted, Illinois was swinging back and forth. Richard Nixon appeared to be leading. Then counts started coming in from Chicago precincts, batches of votes, thousands at a time, overwhelmingly for Kennedy. Some precincts reported more votes than registered voters, and JFK miraculously won Illinois by less than 9,000 votes out of nearly 5 million cast. Historians still debate, did Giancana steal that election? But Giancana himself believed he did, and he expected something in return. Frank gave Giancana guarantees, or at least Giancana thought Frank was giving guarantees. Bobby will be in the administration, but he'll leave you alone. The Justice Department will back off organized crime. Casino licenses in Vegas will come through without problems. The heat will be off. Giancana trusted him, and when Kennedy won by one of the narrowest margins in American history, everyone in the mob believed they'd get what they were promised. Instead, they got Robert Kennedy. JFK made his brother Bobby the Attorney General, and Bobby found his career mission, destroying organized crime. Bobby Kennedy wasn't interested in looking the other way. He was interested in making a name for himself, in building a legacy, in being the man who took down the American Mafia. Between 1961 to 1963, RFK launched the most aggressive campaign against organized crime in American history. He increased the number of Justice Department attorneys focused on organized crime from 17 to 60. He directed the FBI to make the mob their top priority, even over communism, which infuriated J. Edgar Hoover. He expanded wiretaps, brought mob bosses to court, deported suspected members, made their lives hell. Sam Giancana saw FBI agents stationed outside his Chicago home 24/7. He was followed everywhere he went, to restaurants, to meetings, to the golf course. Agents literally walked one step behind him. He couldn't attend business meetings because the FBI was openly watching him. His phone was tapped. His mail was opened. Giancana went to court to get a restraining order against the FBI. The judge laughed him out of court. Giancana went crazy, and he called Frank. "You were the one who told me Kennedy would be good for us," Giancana said on a call that was later transcribed from FBI wiretaps. "You promised Bobby would lay off. Now my guys are getting arrested because of your friend. Frank tried to explain. I can't control Bobby. Nobody can control Bobby. He's doing his own thing. I'll call JFK and talk to him. I'll straighten this out. But JFK wasn't answering Frank's calls anymore. The Kennedys had gotten what they needed from Frank. Now he was a liability. In 1962, JFK was coming to Palm Springs and was supposed to stay at Frank's house. Frank prepared excitedly like a kid before Christmas. He built a new helipad specifically for Marine One, renovated the entire guest wing, installed secure communication systems to meet the Secret Service's requirements, spent hundreds of thousands of dollars. He planned every detail: what food would be served, what drinks would be available, which bedroom the president would use. Then, just days before the visit, Peter Lawford called. The president wouldn't be staying at Sinatra's house. He'd be staying at Bing Crosby's house instead. Frank couldn't believe it. Why? Why Bing? Peter hesitated, then told him the truth. Bobby had told the president that Frank's mob connections would create problems in public opinion, that staying at Sinatra's house would give Republicans ammunition, that they couldn't afford the association. Frank exploded. He took a sledgehammer and personally destroyed the newly built helipad, broke concrete, ripped out the communications equipment, destroyed the guest rooms in a rage. Peter Lawford, who delivered the news, was kicked out of the Rat Pack that same day, and Frank never spoke to him again, ever. When Peter died years later, Frank didn't attend the funeral. Frank was devastated. His political connections, all his prestige had evaporated instantly. He'd delivered for Kennedy. He'd done everything asked of him, and now he was being discarded like garbage, and Giancana still wanted results. By mid-1963, Frank was trapped in the middle of a war he couldn't control. On one side, the Kennedys wouldn't take his calls. Frank offered to organize concerts for the White House. Rejected. He sent party invitations to JFK. No response came back. He tried to go through mutual friends. They politely declined to help. Frank Sinatra, who could get anyone on the phone, couldn't reach the president anymore. On the other side, Giancana was getting increasingly aggressive. You said Kennedy would be good for us, Giancana repeated in call after call. You vouched for him. You put your name on it. Now my guys are going to prison because of your friend. Frank tried to explain. I can't control them. RFK is acting on his own. Even JFK can't control Bobby. But the mob doesn't accept explanations. They wanted results. They wanted Frank to use his Kennedy connection to stop the prosecutions, to make a phone call, to arrange a meeting, to fix what he'd promised to fix. Frank couldn't do it. And worse, Giancana was starting to think Frank had betrayed them intentionally, that Frank had used the mob to help Kennedy, and now that Kennedy had won, Frank was cutting them loose. That wasn't true, but perception was reality. So Giancana started showing up at Frank's properties anyway, uninvited, unwanted, dangerous. This was Giancana sending a message. I don't care about your rules. I don't care about your licenses. I own you. Cal-Neva Lodge was Frank's pride and joy. A resort on the California-Nevada border. Literally half the building in California, half in Nevada. The state line ran through the middle of the property. The Nevada side had gambling. The California side had the celebrity showroom where Frank performed. It was beautiful, sophisticated, the kind of place where Hollywood stars mingled with power brokers. Nevada Gaming Control Board regulations were absolutely explicit. Anyone in the Black Book, the official list of excluded persons, was banned from all Nevada casinos, period. No exceptions. Sam Giancana was in that book. But in July 1963, Giancana showed up at Cal-Neva anyway. He didn't sneak in. He didn't hide. He checked into the VIP bungalows under his own name, ate in the main restaurant, walked through the casino floor greeting people, made sure everyone knew he was there. The Gaming Control Board found out immediately. They had informants everywhere. They called Frank to their offices in Carson City. Mr. Sinatra, Sam Giancana was at your property. You know the rules. You need to explain yourself. Frank's response shocked them. Sam is my friend. I'll have whoever I want at my place. This was insane. This was career suicide. The board said, Mr. Sinatra, if Giancana appears at Cal-Neva again, we'll revoke your license. Frank's response was to invite Giancana back the next month. This was a middle finger. To the Gaming Control Board, to Bobby Kennedy, to the entire system that was trying to control him. Frank was done being controlled by anyone. In early August, Giancana came to Cal-Neva again, this time with singer Phyllis McGuire, Giancana's girlfriend and one of the famous singing McGuire sisters. McGuire was performing in the showroom. She was a huge star in her own right. But everyone knew she was Giancana's woman. One night, an argument broke out between McGuire's manager, Victor LaCroix Collins, and Giancana. The details are murky, but witnesses said Collins made a comment about Giancana's control over McGuire, something about her career, something that questioned Giancana's authority. Giancana called Collins out to the parking lot and beat him unconscious. Cal-Neva staff saw it happen. Security guards witnessed it. Some even considered calling the police, but no one did. You didn't call the cops on Sam Giancana. Collins was hospitalized with a broken jaw and fractured ribs. When Frank learned about what happened, he went ballistic. "He can't do this on my property," Frank reportedly shouted. "This is my place, not his." For years, Frank had walked the tightrope between the mob and legitimacy. He'd been careful, he'd been strategic, but this was too much. Giancana had crossed a line, and Frank decided to confront him. August 1963, Cal-Neva Lodge. After midnight, the casino floor is still busy, slot machines ringing, dealers shuffling cards, Frank's music playing over the speakers. In a private booth in the back of the lounge, Sam Giancana is sitting with two of his associates. They're drinking, smoking cigars, acting like they own the place. Because in Giancana's mind, he does. Frank walks in. His security tries to follow, but Frank waves them off. "Stay back. This conversation is going to be private." Frank slides into the booth across from Giancana. For a moment, neither man speaks. Then Frank breaks the silence. Witnesses who were nearby, staff, other guests, later told investigators and FBI agents what they heard. The conversation got loud, heated, voices carried. Frank leaning forward. "You think I'm your errand boy? You think I'm your messenger to the Kennedys?" Giancana, cold, deadly calm. "I think you're the guy who promised us Kennedy would take care of us. And I think you're the guy who's going to fix this." Frank, voice rising. "I can't fix it. Don't you understand? They won't even take my calls anymore. Bobby's got his own agenda. JFK won't override him. I'm done being in the middle of this." Giancana, "You told us Kennedy would be different. You vouched for him. We delivered Illinois. We delivered West Virginia. We put him in the White House. And in return, Bobby's got my guys in court. My phone's tapped. FBI following me to the bathroom." Frank, jabbing his finger across the table. "I didn't know Bobby would do this. Nobody knew. You think I wanted this?" Giancana, leaning forward menacingly. "I think you used us. I think you got what you wanted. Your Hollywood friends in the White House. And now you're cutting us loose. Frank, that's bullshit and you know it." Giancana, "Then fix it, Frank. Make a call. Arrange a meeting. Do what you promised." Frank, "I can't fix it." The words hang in the air. Giancana's face darkens. His associates tense up, hands moving toward their jackets. Frank sees it, but doesn't back down. "Frank, and you know what else? You can't keep coming here. You're going to cost me my license. You're going to destroy everything I've built." Giancana, voice dropping to a whisper. "Then you better find yourself new friends, Frank. Because if we go down, we're not going down alone." Frank, standing up now, leaning over the table. "Are you threatening me? In my place? In my resort? This is the moment. This is when the photograph was taken, or when a moment just like it was captured." Frank's finger jabbing toward Giancana, his face contorted with rage, the drink spilling on the table. Giancana sitting back, cold and calculating. One of Giancana's men stood up, put a hand on Frank's shoulder. Frank shrugged it off and walked away. The conversation was over, but the damage was catastrophic. Other guests at Cal-Neva heard everything. Staff members witnessed the confrontation. Word spread through the resort within hours. By morning, everyone in Vegas knew. Frank Sinatra had told Sam Giancana to go to hell. The gaming control board heard about it by the next afternoon. They called Frank. "Mr. Sinatra, we need you to come in. We need to discuss the situation." Frank refused. His lawyer, Mickey Rudin, begged him to reconsider. "Frank, if you cooperate, maybe you get a fine, maybe a suspension, but you keep your licenses." "Frank, I'm not testifying about anything. I'm not explaining myself to those people." "Mickey, then you'll lose everything." "Frank, then I lose everything." Within 2 weeks, the Nevada Gaming Commission opened a formal investigation into Cal-Neva. They subpoenaed Frank to testify, to explain Giancana's presence, to answer questions under oath about his relationship with known organized crime figures. Frank refused to appear. His lawyer advised him to compromise. "Frank, just go in, answer a few questions. Tell them you didn't know Giancana would show up. Tell them you asked him to leave. They'll believe you." "Frank, I'm not groveling to them." His business partners at Cal-Neva begged him to settle. "Frank, we'll all lose our investments. Please, just cooperate." "Frank, I don't have to explain anything to those people. They can take their licenses and shove them." On September 1st, 1963, Frank Sinatra surrendered his gaming licenses, all of them. He sold his interests in Cal-Neva and the Sands Hotel properties worth tens of millions of dollars in today's money at fire sale prices. His Vegas empire was gone. Dean Martin confronted him. "Are you out of your mind? You just threw away millions. For what? For your pride." "Frank, nobody tells me who I can have as friends. Nobody tells me how to run my business. Dean, Sam Giancana isn't your friend, Frank. He's using you, Frank, and the Gaming Commission was using me too. And the Kennedys were using me. Everybody was using me. Well, I'm done. The fallout was immediate. Other casino owners distanced themselves from Frank. Bookings were cancelled. Business relationships ended. But the FBI wasn't finished. J. Edgar Hoover had been collecting files on Sinatra for years. Every mob connection, every suspicious meeting, every questionable business deal. The Giancana connection was the ammunition he needed. Hoover called JFK directly. Mr. President, Mr. Sinatra's relationships with organized crime figures represent a national security risk. His continued association with you and your administration is problematic. JFK had already distanced himself, but now it became official policy. No more Sinatra at the White House. No more presidential dinners. No more state events. Frank Sinatra was persona non grata. For the next decade, Frank was under constant FBI surveillance. His phones were tapped. His mail was opened and photographed. His bank accounts were monitored. Every business deal was scrutinized. His associates were questioned. FBI agents followed him to recording sessions, to film sets, to private dinners. The files grew to over 1,300 pages. The political doors that once opened for him slammed shut and locked. No more White House performances. No more intimate dinners with presidents. No more being the bridge between Hollywood and Washington. And the mob, Sam Giancana, never forgave him. In 1965, FBI pressure became so intense that Giancana fled the country. First to Mexico, where he lived in hiding. Then to Italy, where he tried to rebuild his operations. But he couldn't escape Bobby Kennedy's reach. RFK's Justice Department worked with international authorities to make Giancana's life miserable wherever he went. In 1974, after nearly a decade in exile, Giancana returned to the United States. He was older, tired. The Chicago outfit had moved on without him, but he still had secrets. In 1975, Giancana was subpoenaed to testify before the Church Committee, a Senate committee investigating CIA Mafia plots to assassinate Fidel Castro. He was going to reveal everything: how the CIA recruited mobsters to kill Castro, how the mob helped elect Kennedy, how Frank Sinatra was the middleman. Everything. The testimony was scheduled for June 24, 1975. 1 week before his scheduled testimony, Sam Giancana was in his Oak Park, Illinois home. He was cooking sausages in his basement kitchen. Someone entered the house. Someone he knew, because there was no sign of forced entry. Someone he trusted enough to turn his back on. That person pulled out a .22 caliber pistol and shot Sam Giancana 7 times, once in the back of the head, then 6 more times in a circle around his mouth. A mob signature, meaning he talked too much. Sam Giancana died instantly on his kitchen floor. The killer left no evidence, no witnesses, nothing. The murder remains unsolved to this day, but everyone knows why it happened. Giancana knew too much, and dead men tell no tales. Frank never spoke publicly about that night at Cal-Neva, never gave an interview about it, never explained his side, never expressed regret. But those close to him said he never second-guessed his decision. They wanted to own me, Frank reportedly told a friend years later. The mob wanted to own me. The Kennedys wanted to use me. The Gaming Commission wanted to control me. And I decided I'd rather lose everything than let anyone own me. That's the Sinatra nobody talks about. Not the smooth crooner, not the charming entertainer, but the man who would burn his entire empire to the ground rather than bow to anyone. In the mid-1960s, Frank rebuilt from scratch. He founded Reprise Records in 1960, and after losing his Vegas properties, he poured everything into it. He signed new artists, made albums on his own terms, built a label that reflected his artistic vision, not mob interests or corporate demands. He also shifted politically. The Kennedy betrayal left scars that never healed. Frank went from being a prominent Democrat to a staunch Republican. In the 1970s, Frank became close friends with Ronald Reagan. When Reagan became governor of California, Frank raised funds for him. When Reagan ran for president, Frank was one of his biggest supporters. When Reagan won the presidency in 1980, Frank finally returned to the White House, but on his terms this time. He performed at Reagan's inauguration, organized state dinners, was treated as an honored guest, not a useful tool. But the scars remained. He would never again have the kind of power he had in the early 1960s. Never again would he be the man who could pick up the phone and reach anyone. Never again would he be the bridge between two worlds. The Cal-Neva incident broke something fundamental. It proved that even Sinatra had limits, that even he could be forced to choose between competing loyalties. And when he chose himself, when he chose defiance over submission, he lost the empire that defiance had built, but he kept something more important. In 2015, the FBI declassified portions of the Sinatra files, over 1,300 pages of surveillance reports, wiretap transcripts, and investigative memos. The documents showed the extent of the FBI's obsession with Frank, Every phone call monitored, every business meeting documented, every relationship mapped. In one memo dated September 15, 1963, just 2 weeks after Frank surrendered his licenses, J. Edgar Hoover wrote, "Subject Sinatra chose to defy this bureau and the Nevada Gaming Commission, rather than completely sever his ties with organized crime figures. This choice demonstrates a lack of judgment and makes him a person of ongoing interest from a national security perspective. Surveillance will continue indefinitely." Frank lived the rest of his life under that shadow, but he lived it on his own terms. He made movies he wanted to make, sang songs he wanted to sing, said what he wanted to say. He never apologized for his friendships, never denounced the people who helped him when his career was dead. He also never worked with them again. That was Frank's compromise. He wouldn't betray his old friends, but he wouldn't let them control his future. Look at the photograph one final time. That extended finger, that rage, that moment of "I'm done." It cost Frank Sinatra tens of millions of dollars. It ended his relationship with America's most powerful criminal organization. It put him under FBI surveillance for the rest of his life. It closed political doors that never reopened. But it also proved something more important than money, power, or connections. Frank Sinatra bowed to no one. Not the mob who built him, not the government who monitored him, not the Kennedys who used him. He made his choice. He lived with the consequences. And in that single frozen moment of confrontation, you can see exactly who Frank Sinatra really was. The kid from Hoboken, who would burn down his own empire, rather than let anyone own him. The man who chose freedom over everything else. The entertainer who became a legend, not just for his voice, but for his refusal to bend. That's what the photograph captured. The exact instant Frank Sinatra said no to the most powerful forces in America. And here's what he wanted you to know. In the moment when he pointed that finger at Sam Giancana, when he chose pride over survival, Frank Sinatra had never been more free. He lost the empire, but he didn't lose his soul. And today, 60 years later, when people visit what's left of Cal-Neva Lodge, they still talk about that booth in the back of the lounge. This is where it happened, the old-timers say. Where Frank Sinatra told the mob to go to hell. That booth is sacred ground now. Because rarely, so very rarely, does someone risk everything to say no. Frank Sinatra did. And that's why, despite all the scandals, all the FBI files, all the losses, all the controversies, Frank Sinatra is still a legend. Not just because he could sing like no one else, but because when it mattered most, he stood alone, and he never bent. If this story hit you the way it hit me, do me a favor, hit that subscribe button right now, because Frank Sinatra's story doesn't end here. There's the 1972 Caesar's Palace incident, where the mob sent one final message. There's the mysterious Marilyn Monroe connection that the FBI covered up for decades. There's the real reason JFK cancelled that Palm Springs visit, and it's darker than you think. This channel is dedicated to uncovering the stories they don't want you to know. The untold legacies of the legends who shaped America. Frank Sinatra, Dean Martin, Sammy Davis Jr., the Rat Pack. These weren't just entertainers. They were men who lived between two worlds and paid the price. Subscribe to Frank Sinatra, The Untold Legacy, and turn on notifications. Because next week we're revealing what really happened in 1972 at Caesar's Palace. And trust me, that story will change everything you thought you knew about Frank's final years. The photograph you saw today, that was just the beginning. The real story, that's what we're building here. So subscribe, hit the bell, and join us as we uncover the truth behind the legend. See you in the next one.